Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this CISMOR seminar on this very hot day. I hope you are all keeping cool. And my name is Doron Cohen. I'm a research fellow at CISMOR, and I will. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's seminar, Dr. Esben Petersen. Short introduction only. Dr. Petersen studied at the University of Copenhagen and received his PhD in church history from Goethe University in Frankfurt. He even spent a year studying at our own School of Theology here in Deutsche. And now he is a full-time lecturer at the Language Education Center of Ritsumeikan University. His book, The Early Swiss and German Mission in Japan, Paradoxes of Liberal Theology, was published last year by Chisokudo publication in Nagoya. Now, today's lecture by Dr. Petersen begins with Uchimura Kanzō. As you all were well aware, Uchimura was a very unique Christian leader and one of the foremost intellectuals of Meiji and Taisho Japan. A lot have been written about him, but it's always interesting to hear something new. And today, from a certain unique perspective of Uchimura's special interest in Denmark and what he made of it and how what kind of influence it had. Another point of interest is that, as you may know, Denmark is often regarded or described as the happiest country in the world, or one of the happiest, a very lucky place to live for those who live there. And Dr. Petersen will also ask the question, why is it so? Why is Denmark thought to be so happy? What does it mean? And we are looking forward to hear all about this. The lecture will go on for about an hour, and then we will have about 30 minutes for questions and answer as much or as many as there will be. So please, Dr. Petersen, you may start with your lecture.
Thank you very much, Professor Cohen, for the very kind words, and thank you also for the invitation, first of all, to Tokai University and also CISMOR specifically. And of course, also welcome to you participating online. I hope you can hear me. If not, I'm sure some of you will let me know somehow during the lecture. So let me first of all share my PowerPoint. Hi, okay, there we are. So this is the first title page. So let me move on. So here is a short overview of what I have been thinking of presenting. And as you can see, it's probably some topics that I hope to present and maybe afterwards discuss with you. Some very broad topics that are probably maybe too broad and too generalized to be included in this presentation, but sometimes I think it's relevant to take some of these bigger discussion, and I hope you will join me and perhaps even find it relevant afterwards. So just a little context of the talk. As Professor Cohen said, I have been privileged to stay in Kyoto, in this wonderful city, since April this year, working at Ritsumeikan University. I'm currently working on a Kakenhi project application titled Ecological Crisis, Past and Present, and their place within Japanese Christianity. The Kakenhi proposal and this talk today is still very much a work in progress, and I'm looking very much forward to, and also afterwards, get some comments and discussion. And if you should be interested, the wrong button here. You can also read one of my articles touching a little bit about today's topic, published this year in March. And of course, as Professor Cohen mentioned, my book from last year, The Early Swiss and German Mission in Japan, Paradoxes of Liberal Theology. The two publications, although different in the theme they present, forms the background of the present project that I'm presenting today. So why my sudden interest in Uchimura and his writings about Denmark? In one way, it's a continuation of my previous work, having been dealing mainly with Christian mission in Japan, but also the circulation between East and West and global Christianity in a more general sense. What has been triggering for this project is the field of transcultural understandings. Especially in the recent years, there's been a scholarly interest into looking at intercultural and transcultural phenomena. The story of Denmark as the happiest country in the world has been told again and again, both in national but also international medias, especially after 2012, when Denmark was named the happiest country in the United Nations World Happiness Report. And while there has been a number of scholars who have written about Denmark and its so-called proclaimed happiness, when I began this preliminary research into the topic, I found myself curious about the prehistory of this narrative. Where does this story of the happy country Denmark come from? To what extent does this narrative correspond to reality? And finally, to what extent did scholars complicit in the creation of this narrative? As you can see from the slide here, there exists a whole industry of different kinds of books from various sides of the scholarly scale that confirm the story of Denmark as the happiest country. Social media and influencers have only accelerated this narrative ever since. However, Denmark is not the only example of such stories being created. Similar cases can be found in Japan. There exists a long tradition of Orientalist and auto-exercising language in the study of Japan. I myself am a specialist of missionary literature from the 19th century, and here you often see Japan described as the other, a land of paradox, a land of opposites, and so on. Recent studies have also shown how Japanese people eagerly contribute to this portrayal of Japan's essential so-called weirdness as a way of reinforcing Japanese identity and pride. There's a common acceptance among Japanese people that they can read the air, kuki o yomu, or that they can communicate without words, ishin denshin. One aspect which the slide is focusing on, which has drawn large attention in the last few years, especially within Buddhist studies, is the adopted Western narrative of Zen and mindfulness in Japan. Preposterously, Japan, as the Nichibunkan scholar Yamada Shoji argues, has adopted Western narratives of Zen because of their unique description of the Japanese. Yamada described this phenomenon of reinforcing national identity as magic mirrors. Magic mirrors, he says, reflects an image distorted in a beautiful way. People want to think, yes, indeed, this is how I really look. So the study of how magic mirrors, so to say, are created fills a lot in scholarly publications today, race, culture, identity. have become terms challenging classical understanding of national identity today. As you can see, these mirrors exist everywhere and often also makes us who we are. The question of how the story of Denmark as the happiest country in the world was conceived, I believe, forms another example of such a magic mirror. In this talk, I will focus on Uchimura Kanzō and engage in a journey of self-discovery that surprisingly takes me back to Taisho and Showa Japan, with keywords as agrarian Christianity and Japanese imperialism as my tracks. When researching Uchimura Kanzō's the story of Denmark and the story of how faith and forestry saved the country, it becomes clear that it reflects a story which reinforces this national identity and pride also among the Danish people. But how come this is the case? In fact, reading Uchimura myself kind of enforces some strange feeling of national proudness. One almost feel like accepting this so-called magic mirror as a view of truth. But how is it that a text written in Japan over a century ago comes to form a social consensus of a people on the other side of the world? The question is something I still don't have a firm answer to, but it is a question that has formed the main motivation for this talk. In the following, I will want to look into two objectives. First of all, look into the motivations as to why Uchimura chose to write about Denmark, and also look into the adoption of this narrative of Denmark following Uchimura's publication. So let's get started from the beginning. On October the 22nd, 1911, while the Japanese flag was flying over the Korean peninsula, a lecture called The Story of Denmark was given in the Ritsumeikan Hall in Tokyo, in Kashiwagi in Shinjuku. The name of the lecture, unsurprisingly, was Uchimura Kanzō. Uchimura Kanzō was already at that time a nationwide, if not even a world-known, at least in the Western Hemisphere, Christian theologian and social critic. In the lecture, Uchimura spoke about Denmark in a very positive way as a peace-loving, economic, competitive, small nation state that had managed to rebuild its nation by reforesting the heat after its defeat at the Schleswig War in 1864. The text was then later published a month or less than a month later in Uchimura's own journal, the Seisho Kenkyu, or the Bible Studies. And only 2 years later, it was published again, this time as a pamphlet by the Bible Research Society, Seisho Kenkyusha, and given the full title from which we know it today. The booklet also included this photography of Enrico Dalkas, who forms the hero of Uchimura's story, and I will return to him later. But the photo, according to the prominent scholar within Japanese Christianity, Suzuki Norihisa, was obtained through Maria Wolf, the translator of two of Uchimura's previous books, How I Became a Christian and Represented Japanese into Danish. So, hand in hand with the agricultural movement boom of the 1910s and 13s, Uchimura's booklet on Denmark became an almost fashionable and a trendy kind of wisdom among intellectuals. Uchimura's 2 years after the publication of the book, Uchimura himself reported in a newspaper article about the reception of his story and the general physical evidence that it had amounted to, by reporting that millions of trees had been planted by forest owners in the northeastern of Japan and Korea. Uchimura himself also returned to the story of Denmark several times, most significantly in in the book Plant a Tree, and also in the book on Denmark and the model country of the West. According to a commentary by Suzuki Norihisa in the Iwamini Bunko version, the story of Denmark was reprinted then again in 1934, this time giving the title Kokoko no Momi, and in 1946 and 1947 and 1948, the book just after the war was then printed again, this time in the Japanese language textbook Kokoko Go, published by the Ministerial Application and given the title Midori no Ya. This time it was the more anti-war message of the book and not its agricultural message that found its significance among readers. In 1956, the text had then been included in the collection of Japanese literature classes for school children, being published no more than 14 times ever since, in giving the title Midori no Do Denmaku, according to Kobuta and Kimura. So the text became also became a widely discussed topic among Japanese Christian elites as well. It's not an exaggeration to say that it was accepted as a central text in the discussion of the future of Japanese Christianity in the 1910s to up to the Second World War, proclaiming that the text presented an ideal image of a Christian country, and believing in Uchimura's writing of 100%, countless numbers of people, as I will return to later, took it as a starting point for the development of their understanding of Denmark, that still today uncritically enjoys a prominent status in Japan. It is not. I do not actually know of any other document on the topic of Denmark that has been accepted this uncritically. But one day when I was starting my research into Uchimura and the text, I found this statement written by a scholar in the field. While Uchimura Kanzō used Denmark to describe the peaceful state, he never visited or ever had a profound interest in Denmark. To be honest, I was a bit surprised. First of all, I was starting my research to know that he didn't even visit Denmark before writing the text. Even more surprised was I perhaps to learn that he seemed not to have much interest in Denmark after he wrote the text. But if this is indeed the case, then we need to ask ourselves, what exactly is the booklet that Uchimura Kanzō wrote? Why would Uchimura in October 1911 decide to give a talk about Denmark? And what motives laid behind? In the following, I wish to discuss these three questions. But Uchimura's text, as I mentioned, have gone through multiple reprintings in Japan and can easily be purchased at any online bookstore, on Amazon.com or Kinokuniya. And I would like to recommend the listeners today to buy the book or find the original text online. And if for non-Japanese speakers, I will, after this talk, upload shortly a half-poor translation in English, so you can read it quietly. But for now, I just want to give a small summary of the text and tell what it's about. So Uchimura basically tells a story of how the Heat Company, or Hedeselskabet, the beautiful Danish word, and the co-founder Enrico Mylius Dalgas led Denmark's economic and moral recovery after 1864 through the revitalization of the Heat of Jylland. The historical context here is in 1864, the Prussian, led by Bismarck, decided to invade Denmark and conquer the two southern duchies, Schleswig and Holstein. And suddenly Denmark has lost approximately 1/3 of its overall area, and find itself in economical and cultural straits. In this time of crisis, suddenly a slogan in Denmark emerges. What is lost outwards must be regained from within, or gained from within. Denmark begins to limit its military budgets and initiating domestic reform programs. Specifically, Denmark transformed itself by restoring a spiritual long decade program of restoring spiritual dynamism of its people through the implementation of the so-called Folkhøj schools or Folkehøjskole, and also a series of radical land reforms and agricultural corporate movements, to which is the focus of Uchimura's talk and the focus of Dalgas's company. As you can see, here is a map of Denmark. This is the half island, the peninsula Jutland, and before the war, all these black dots were heat as unused land or non-agricultured land, and after 1940, you can see a large chunk of it has been agricultured and firmed, and this is mostly due to Enrico Dalgas and this agricultural reforms that happened after the war of 1864. So the revival history of Denmark, as mentioned above by Uchimura, is personified by Enrico Dalgas. Following the loss of the war, Uchimura makes Dalgas the father of the quote just mentioned before, when he writes, "Now it is time of evil for Denmark. Now it is a bad day for Denmark," said his colleague. "It is indeed a bad day for Denmark. Indeed it is," replied Dalgas. "What we have lost on the outside, we will regain from within. And in your lifetime and mine, we can make the fields of Jutland a blooming rose." People knowledgeable with the Old Testament will find a similarity here to Isaiah 35, book 1 and 2. Here we find a similar quote which focus on the blooming of a desert land. In fact, this quote, Uchimura uses this as the opening quotation for the article himself. Uchimura describes how Dalgas cleared the heathland of the Jutland Peninsula, planted trees, and created new farmlands. Dalgas discovers a way to grow giant fir trees for building timber, and in a Job-like story, Dalgas conquer all the challenges due to his faith, and he and his son succeeds in rebuilding Denmark, not through the war or invasion, but through peaceful means of tree planting. Dalgas and Denmark represent an alternative to Japan's more conventional embrace of imperialism and war at the time. Dalgas and the Danes emerged as heroic, enlightened, and industrious people whose experience has allowed them to make the unlikely choice to avoid conflict and find strength in the agrarian life of its people. According to Uchimura, the story of Denmark taught the Japanese 3 lessons. First, war is an absolute evil, but defeat is not necessarily a misfortune for a nation. On the contrary, it can spur national revival and economic development. A country's strength is not its military, but its culture, level of education, and spirituality. Secondly, it is possible for any country to make the best out of its natural and human resources to achieve prosperity. It is not necessary to become, according to Uchimura, a global industrial and colonial power like Britain. It is okay just to be Denmark. And what Denmark has taught the world is that it's more important to develop the country inwards than to conquer territories outwards. Thirdly, and perhaps most important for Uchimura, the third lesson is that faith can move mountains, or as he believed had happened in Denmark, cultivate the heat and make a depressed and poor country optimistic and rich. As he says, a country's strength, true strength, is not its army, not its warship, it is not gold or silver, it is faith. I will skip this and move on to the tension between Christianity and imperialism. So repeatedly, Uchimura point that Dalgas is a descendant of Huguenot refugees. In fact, as Takada Sensei has mentioned, Uchimura was an immigrant from Naples, son of Danish parents, and moved back to Denmark when he was 7, when his father died. Anyway, the emphasis on Dalgas as an exemplary Danish patriot belonging to a religious and ethnic minority is addressed used as an address to criticized Japan's Shinto nationalists for their narrow conception of Japaneseness. It can also be interpreted as an argument for including not only Japanese Christians, but also colonized Koreans and Chinese as fully contributing citizens. The example of Dalgas and Denmark's religious freedom, implies that all citizens of the Japanese Empire are equal members of the political community. This also applies to those minorities who does not profess Shinto as a state religion. So the extremely positive image of Denmark that Uchimura paints continues in many ways today in Japan. As in Uchimura's time, in general public knowledge of Denmark is the general public knowledge of Denmark is rather incomplete and sometimes very stereotypical. But unlike countries like the United States or Russia or China, Denmark is generally seen as an unambiguously positive country. Many of the basic elements are the same today as they were in 1911. The notion of a highly developed, prosperous small state with a hardworking and well-educated population that values humanitarianism and trade and ecology still exist today. It has been supplemented today by elements of welfare state, gender equality, and designer goods. And it's hard to find any Japanese who has anything bad to say about Denmark. And I believe Uchimura deserves a big credit for this. The question, however, still remains, why would Uchimura in the first place write about Denmark? I will answer this by first introducing shortly to the audience who might not still be sure who Uchimura is, a little bit about the person. So Uchimura is most famous for being the founder of the non-church movement, the Mukkyokai or the Mukkyokai Shugi. He's also famous for being a religious pacifist and environmentalist. He worked as a civil servant, university and high school teacher, journalist, theologian, preacher, environmentalist, activist, and then he was, which is important maybe for our talk, one of the first followers of Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher in Japan. His political philosophy can be described as an unstable synthesis of the samurai ideas of Bushido, Christianity inspired by Quakers and of Kierkegaard, Japanese nationalism, and liberal internationalism. At first, all these many different kinds of directions of beliefs is kind of confusing. But in the world of Uchimura, it all somehow makes sense. I think this is partly also the reason why Uchimura Kanzō still seems to attract a lot of interest from scholars. There seems not to be just one way of interpreting his works. So I also want to just focus on the tombstone of Uchimura and Tama City Cemetery in Tokyo. This also kind of illustrates Uchimura's person, the mixture of ideas in Uchimura as well. Here it says, I for Japan, Japan for the world for Christ, and all for God. This quote, I believe, is also really a good indication to why Uchimura wrote about Denmark. Through his life, he is most famous for trying to reconcile the two J, Japan and Jesus. And in his work, he often referred both to East Asian and Western traditions, and both religious and secular thought. While this gives us a good picture of the person Uchimura, it still doesn't explain why he would chose to write about Denmark. I will therefore, in the next shortly, give my three ideas to, or the three motives behind why he may have written about Denmark in the first place. I will start with the first one, which I call faith and the belief in the miraculous recovery. Let's begin by focusing on the subtitle of the text. Here, the story of Denmark, a story of how faith and forestry saved a country. Uchimura's story about Denmark is, first of all, I believe, a story about Christian rejuvenation. As the subtitle indicates, the text emphasizes the importance of Christianity as a source of national power. According to Uchimura, Denmark's miraculous recovery after the loss of the Schleswig War can be attributed to the power of faith. Dalga's success in reforesting the Danish heath originated in the Huguenot background, which allowed him to plow the Danish heath and plant fir trees. Uchimura, however, also stresses that it is impossible to overlook the fact that Dalga's project would have been unsuccessful had it not been shared by the faith of the Danes. That is, faith is the power that overcomes the world and conquers the earth. The faith of the Huguenots saved Denmark with plow and fir trees. Only if Dalgas had faith, but the Danish people as a whole did not, his work would have been in vain. The man, the people, the faith, the free faith imported from France and native to Denmark is the reason for the great achievement. A liberal faith, or Jiu Shinko here, is Uchimura states effectively allowed people to live lives of an unshakable conviction. There, in other words, seems to be an obvious goal here in Uchimura's writing about Denmark, which seems to illuminate the true nature of faith in its very free form, as it functioned in and was expressed through the various situations in which it was given its ideal form in Denmark. Uchimura's story is very much a story based on facts. According to Suzuki Norihisa, Uchimura borrowed his information of the story from the American magazine McClure magazine and the article Reclaiming the Heat, How Denmark Converted a Desert into a Farming Country from Henry Gundard Leeds. The article published in July 1911, so only 3 months before Uchimura gave his talk. According to Murai Makoto, the Leeds article is based on largely on what he had heard directly from Frederick Dalgas, who was the son of Enrico Dalgas, who had visited the United States in 1911 on the invitation of the then President Theodore Roosevelt. The story of Denmark is an adoption of this, based on this article, but Uchimura stylishly has mixed it with poetic images and Bible quote and made it a story much more about Enrico Dalgas than about the Hedeselskab, the Heats Company, from which is the main focus point of Henry Gundard Leeds' article. There's also a personal background to Uchimura's text of Denmark's rejuvenation, I believe, because it correlates with his daughter Ruths, or Ruth, being seriously ill with tuberculosis at the time. Her death at the age of only 18 happened only 3 months after the publication of the text on January 12th in 1912. The death of Ruth, his only daughter, so John House describes, had a significant influence, existential influence on Uchimura. Ruth being seriously ill at the time Uchimura gave his talk at the Meikan Hall in Tokyo may have been a way for Uchimura to look for signs of strength in the world, even in the darkest moments of life. Uchimura's story of Denmark's rejuvenation due to faith indeed seems to mirror Uchimura's own personal circumstances and his firm belief in Christ and his daughter's recovery at the time. I want to focus now on the second motive, inspiration from outside. Here I mean people who came and who visited Japan and told him about Denmark, or told him about Denmark. The story of Denmark is very much an agricultural article adopted for Christian readers. This can be seen from the first quote of the story. Here you also see again a quote from Isaiah. In fact, Isaiah, out of the 4 quotes there is from the Old Testament in the text, 3 of the text comes from Isaiah's book. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into sickles. Nations shall not lift up a sword again against nation, neither shall they learn to fight anymore. Uchimura skillfully uses the metaphor to describe the agricultural wonder of Erik and Douglas and the wonder of Denmark as a product of faith based on pacifism. However, it's also not a surprise that Uchimura used all these agricultural quotes from the Bible, because Uchimura was himself a student of agricultural science. In 1877, he was sent to Sapporo to study at the Sapporo Agricultural College. And here he met with the American Methodist William S. Clark. William S. Clark is a very famous person in Japan, and mostly because he was the one who baptized Uchimura. He also taught him agricultural science, but he was most significantly the one who introduced Uchimura to Christianity. What is not known by so many is that Clark actually has a small connection to Denmark. Clark received his PhD in agricultural science at Göttingen University in 1853. Göttingen is a city located a little bit south of Hamburg. And he also stayed in Hamburg, close to the Danish border at the time. As we remember here, Denmark at the time of Clark went all the way down to the city of Hamburg. So Clark, those must have been a witness of the developments going on at Denmark at the time of the Højskole movement, the folk high school movement. The ideas of the Folkehøjskole was first formulated by the Danish theologian Grundtvig through education about the history of one's fatherland and the importance of national community. People were to learn and take responsibility for the country's future. The Folkehøjskole became a revolutionizing place where ideas and knowledge, especially within agricultural science, could be exchanged and discussed. The first Folkehøjskole was formed by Christian Flor in Røddinge in 1884. Røddinge is around here, if I'm not mistaken. And but it was especially after the defeat of 1864 that the Folkehøjskole became a national reconstruction project. In 1877, when Clark began teaching Uchimura in Sapporo, there were 54 Folkehøjskole in Denmark. Returning to Clark, when he returned to America after his PhD in Germany, he also brought some of these ideas of the Folkehøjskole to Massachusetts Agricultural College and initiated a agricultural reform there based off some of the ideas of Grundtvig. When Uchimura's interest in Denmark started, it's still very hard to say. In this early state of my research, I still haven't found any concrete proof that Clark taught Uchimura and his other pupils about the Danish Folkehøjskole, but there is a clear link between Clark and Denmark, which make it difficult to believe, not to believe that Uchimura, while at the Agricultural College, must have introduced, at least briefly, some ideas of the Folkehøjskole movement. Then there's also another person which are relevant for Uchimura's conception of Denmark. That is the friendship with Gundard and the introduction of the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. Gundard was a German missionary who came to Japan in 1906. He, according to John House, developed a sophisticated friendship with Uchimura found in no other Westerners. In 1907, Gundard introduced Uchimura to Søren Kierkegaard, and Kierkegaard, as also stated earlier in talk, became important for Uchimura's own struggle against the church and for his foundation of the Mukkyokai Shugi. Uchimura recognized in Kierkegaard ideas of similarity to his own theology. I will skip Gundard because of time and also because there are plenty of books that have researched him better than I have. So I ask you to read them should you have more interest in Gundard. Then there is another interesting topic, which I know my colleague Christian Hermansen have researched a lot on. Just months before Uchimura gives his talk about Denmark in 1911, he gets a visit from two Danish missionaries in his office in Tokyo. These two missionaries are Jens Michael Thøgersen Winther and the visiting missionary Carl Skovgaard Petersen. The missionaries visited Uchimura in Tokyo, and if we could get an idea of what transpired between Uchimura and the two missionaries during the time, we should be able to understand perhaps more clearly the interpersonal relationship surrounding the publication of the story in Denmark. Luckily, we know from Skovgaard Petersen, who wrote in the same year of Uchimura's book, his own book of his visit to Japan, that what transpired. Here we get it's a long quote, but I would read a little bit in the end here. Here he says about Uchimura, he is something of a Japanese Kierkegaard, if you will. However, he does not have a deep knowledge of Kierkegaard, but only know him indirectly through German friends. He is currently working on Isaiah in particular and will publish a book soon. So what is written here seems to be of great importance, but since we have no context, it is not clear what is going on. We can only surmise what is going on here. It appears that before Uchimura met the two Danish missionaries, the draft for the story of Denmark had not yet begun, but was in Uchimura thought. Uchimura consulted with the two Danish visitors about Denmark, about Kierkegaard, about the Church of Denmark, but he did not mention the article about Denmark. How should this be understood? Can it be interpreted to mean that perhaps it was the visit from the two Danish missionaries in the spring of 1911 that inspired Uchimura to write about Denmark the same year? It is hard to know. What we can see is, as I mentioned before, the quotes of Isaiah, as most of the Bible quotes in the text are from Isaiah. So there's a correlation between Uchimura actually working on Isaiah that year and also using a lot of quotations from Isaiah. Then I want to focus on the third motive, which is the Japan's colonization of Korea. In general, scholars who have written about the story of Denmark forget to situate us in its time. The text correlates right with the time where Korea becomes a part of the Japanese imperial empire. 1 year before, in 1910, the Japanese empire finished its colonization of Korea, and in 1911, Uchimura gives his talk about Denmark. Shortly after the colonization, especially among Japanese Christians, there is a profound belief that these new territories can only bring goodness to Japanese Christianity. Here's a quote from Emily Anderson, who says, the Japanese Christian at home began to imagine these overseas Japanese and their new homes as inextricably linked to each place and of possibility, not only for Japanese in general, but also for Japanese Christian in particular. They argued that Christianity, transcendent qualities, would form the crucial basis for a new type of empire. These Christians were driven by an ambitious belief that Japanese Christianity possessed this unique capacity to transform the world. In Christian journals, we see from the period, you see a rise of articles discussing how to incorporate Korea and Manchuria into Japan's future, and how to expand Japan's spirituality abroad. Taking this movement of thought into account, we may ask ourselves, was the story of Denmark as a propaganda article functioning as an utopian idea of what Japan's overseas communities in Manchuria and Korea on one day might become if they realize the most sanguine ambition of their faith? Couldn't this story symbolize the same idea of which Emily Anderson mentions beforehand, that the idea that Christianity forms the transcendent qualities of the crucial basis of a new type of empire in Manchuria or Korea, a Japanese Christian empire? Many of the biggest Christians at the time, especially Ibina Danjo, but also Toyohiko Kagawa and some of the people who were influenced by Uchimura, which I will mention just in a moment, traveled to Manchuria, traveled to Korea, and initiated agrarian reforesting projects in these places, and were obviously inspired by Uchimura. So there are also many similarities between the Danish heat on which nothing grows and the dry wastelands of Manchuria and the cold landscape of Korea. Uchimura stresses that Denmark has succeeded to resubmerge to its past greatness because of its revival, because the revival had been rooted in Christian faith. In the story of Denmark, we find quotes that are used as guidelines and words of advice for future settlements of Christians in Korea and Manchuria. So while the text specifically on the surface is about Denmark, it is also an abstract or ideal of what Japan and especially Manchuria and Korea perhaps should aspire for. So I'm going to skip the summary here. So I want to focus now, before my time runs out, on the immediate influence of Uchimura's story of Denmark. Uchimura's story initiated what I have called a Denmark boom in the 1920s and 1930s. Suddenly, many people started traveling to Denmark and to see the wondrous land firsthand themselves. In fact, in researching Uchimura Kanzō's text, I have discovered that the texts have exerted an influence in unexpected directions. There's a large number of books and articles, both academic and not academic, which seem to be borrowing on Uchimura's original text. I will shortly give a summary of some of the people who were inspired by Uchimura's idea and wrote and traveled to Denmark themselves. Of course, the most famous one of them is Kagawa Toyohiko. He visited Denmark in 1925. He was invited by the Danish missionary from before, Jens Michael Thøgersen, who and after his return to Japan, he published the article Danish Impressions or Denmark no Indsho. Here he expands on the description of Denmark by telling of his personal experience visiting various folkehøjskoler. The article, or like Uchimura's, portrays a very positive image of Denmark as an idyllic state with healthy blonde people full of happiness. That I want to show you a few quotes because it's kind of sweet what he's writing. So the peasant high school has started its season for women on May 1st. Consequently, there are 150 young women from all over Denmark gathered in Hasle. Compared to the daughters of Germany, their futures are beautiful, and 9 of 10 are beauties. I did not see a single face like those of the malnurtured peasant girls in Japan. All of them had apple chins and shone like stars. Similarly, he writes, I am truly happy in Denmark. Visiting Denmark have generally understood the meaning of Christianity in the life of the people. If you want to see Europe, do not visit the big nation. The smaller ones are much better ruled. I am truly pleased to have seen Belgium, Holland, and Denmark. I feel touring these countries have shown me the real Europe. England, France, or Germany is not the real Europe. They are hell. When I come back to Japan, I intend to calm down a bit. Here, I mean to calm down spiritually. I have no intention of making withered wood bloom. I want to be a seed sower all my life. Initially, Grundtvig's school had only 4 students. I want to start with 4 students. So returning to Japan, Kagawa actually established himself several so-called Folkehøj schools, schools based on the Folkehøj school model as well. And Kagawa's travel report on Denmark in general is born out of Uchimura's story of Denmark. Looking at the article, you see several obvious references to Uchimura's work himself, including references to Enrico Dalgas. However, Kagawa's article also stood on its own. Returning to Japan, as I said, he forms his own school. So Kagawa is very interesting, and I could talk about him longer, but I want to go to the next person here. Another person who was influenced by Uchimura's work was this fellow, Kato Kanyo. Kato Kanyo is a very controversial figure because his example shows the fine line that exists between national democratic values and national fascism. And it gives us an idea of how Uchimura's idea also transpired into these imperialist ideas as well. Kato was an educator and of farmers who aspired to regenerate the agricultural communities as a spiritual and material foundation of the nation. He once converted to Christianity under the influence of American missionary, but later became a follower of a Shinto theorist and professor of Tokai University. In 1924, just 1 year before Kagawa, he travels to Asgård Folkehøjskole and stays there for a year. He masters the Danish language and translates several works of Hans Christian Andersen. Back in Japan, he established the Japanese higher folk school, the Nihon Kokumin Koto Gakko, that is based on ideas of Grundtvig. Oops, my screen is here. The educational movement of Kato and others in the early stages was expected to be like Denmark. However, it slowly incorporates Shinto nationalist ideas and become very critical of the Danish ideas. Kato had a problem. Poor peasants had no land to cultivate, to cultivate their own land. So Kato believed that the land had to be found for them somewhere else in the world. For him, Manchuria offered the best opportunity. He persuaded the military authorities to initiate an agricultural immigration policy to which 5 million poor peasants were to be sent to Manchuria in an attempt to fulfill Uchimura's idea of reforesting the cold steppes of the Chinese highlands, Mongolian highlands. So in the end, not 5 million, but 300,000 Japanese are sent to Manchuria, where many of them are left after the left there to be after the war of after the end of the war, the Second World War. Kato's life is also very fascinating and also worth much deeper study than this presentation can give. However, I want to just quickly turn to the last person that also was influenced by Uchimura's text, which is Matsumai Shigeyoshi. He was a disciple of Uchimura and worked at the Ministry of Telecommunication. In 1934, he studies in Germany and also managed to visit several Folkehøjskoler. Obviously inspired by Uchimura and Kagawa, he comes back to Japan and established the Bosei Gakuryuku in Tokyo. And also after the war, he established, in 1946, he established the Tokai University, also based on Grundtvigian ideas. The logo or the slogan of Tokai University today has many similarities, not only to Uchimura, but also to Grundtvig, the spirit of tree, love God, love people, and love the earth. Interesting is that, as the Japanese scholar Koyama Tetsui has said, there is a similarities between these logos in Denmark. You have the Uchimura's concept, Uchimura's Grundtvig's concept, people should love God, love neighbor, and fatherland. And Kagawa used the same holy trinity almost. The school desires to teach the people to love God, love neighbor, and country. In other ways, we can see that the story of Denmark developed in many different directions. And in the 1920s and 30s, the positive image of Denmark transpired and intervened very much indeed with Japanese empirical policies. And I want to turn to the understanding of Denmark today before the last 2 minutes runs out. So what kind of associations are conquered up by the word of Denmark in Japan today? I showed in the beginning of the talk that the collection of recent published books in one way or another are concerned with the idea of happy Denmark. In many ways, there seems to be a continuation of this uncritical characterization of Denmark, where keywords of free Christianity, agriculture, and pacifism has been expanded with words such as education, welfare, and ecological happiness, however, remains as the constant description of the Danes in Japanese literature. I would like to end the talk by mentioning 2 books that unexpectedly forms this amusing context. One of them is A Simple and Rich Life in Denmark, the happiest country in the world. This is one of those easy written, easy read lifestyle books like the kind we all well know from the local bookshop. The author is called Yoshiko Bull. She is an author of several books of Scandinavian lifestyle and has a homepage. On her homepage, she describes herself as a life producer. I'm not quite sure what a life producer is, but it seems very fine. According to the book, there exists a connection between Denmark and happiness and design. And she also includes this wonderful word, hygge, to which she describes Denmark has a unique concept called hygge. It cannot be translated into any other language or any other country, a unique philosophy, a unique culture. And I think it's also a key to realizing why they are happy. The book borrows this pop word hygge and as right as something unique, although I would say the German word gemütlich is very similar to the word of hygge. However, there's also the other book, which is Why Danish Women Shine, Building a Society of Advanced Happiness Nation. In Denmark, he says, which rank on the top of the world in happiness service, women are raising children while working vigorously. Here the focus become women right in Denmark and how work-life balance are achieved and allowing the women in Denmark to work and raising children at the same time. The interesting is here again the connection of these factors with happiness. There are many more books touching the concept of happiness. Life in Denmark, the happiest country in the world, with a consumption tax of 25%. It's this one, Happy Denmark, Unhappy Japan, Danish values and the possibility of improving happiness. Examined here again the word hygge. And then we have another one, lykke, which is called the Little Book of Lykke, Happiness, which is also focused on Denmark. So it cannot be denied that furniture design or work-life balance or high consumption tax are unique qualities to Denmark and the sole source of happiness. However, the key point I want to finish this talk with is, and this little list, is that when one searches for uniqueness of a country through diverse interpretations, such uniqueness will be generated. However, this is not thereby said that unique qualities are indeed unique. In fact, often it is the opposite. Let's look at Uchimura's famous quote again, what is lost outwards must be gained inwards. This is often interpreted even today as a quote of pacifism. But historically, Denmark was not a pacifist country after 1864. Denmark, in fact, engaged in a war with Austrian Prussia again in 1866 and military supported the French army in the French-Prussian War in 1870. The same thing can also be said about the revitalization of the heat of Jylland, the engineering work of Enrico Dalgas, which made him such unique, which made him a prophet, according to Uchimura. This again was also not something very unique to Denmark at the time. In fact, there were several similar engineering projects which took place all over Europe at the time. So is it therefore a stretch interpretation to say that Denmark is a pacifist country, or like Uchimura says, or to say that Denmark is the happiest country in the world, and that the sign, hygge, or education represent the true reasons behind? I'll leave the question open, but it seems to me to be sometimes a very naive interpretation. Anyway, let's finish with a few questions. A magic mirror. To what degree have Uchimura's story of Denmark created a so-called magic mirror in Denmark? Can we actually talk of a magic mirror, and how then has this story of Danes become accepted by themselves? This is still something that I'm looking into. I just want to show this my internet newspaper article. This is about a company called Exporting Happiness, which is a government-funded program by the Happiness Institute, which is supported by the Foreign Ministry, which is like Japan's soft power, if you remember Abe-san's idea of spreading happiness as a myth and somehow this myth has more or less been accepted by the Danes themselves and also brought into, of course, this company is more or less, there's a economical motivation behind it, but it is slowly a story that has also been adopted by the Danes themselves. Anyway, there's many other questions I wish to discover in the future. First of all, I want to finish my talk and say thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much.